The summer of 1852 in rural Georgia smelled of iron and rot. The river behind the Winthrop plantation ran low that year, revealing things the soil had meant to keep buried. Rusted chains, bones the color of clay, and a rust-stained cradle lodged in the mud. The townspeople said it was a sign that the land itself was exhaling. No one dared speak of what it exhaled. Jonathan Winthrop, a widowed planter and former militia chaplain, had built his estate on scripture and superstition. His sermons in the barn were as famous as his cruelty. He claimed God had spoken to him one night through the cries of a stillborn calf, told him that purity no longer came from heaven, but from the earth beneath his feet. The next morning he locked the church and began what he called the renewal. Neighbors heard the first screams 3 nights later, not of pain but of something raw and ceremonial. His 3 daughters, pale and obedient, were forbidden from leaving the house after dusk. The field hands whispered that the master's strongest slave, Elias, was taken to the upper room every moonlit night, his body slick with oil and ash led by Jonathan's own hand. 9 months later, the doctor who delivered the children left Georgia altogether. He told no one what he saw, only muttered to a nurse that the newborns didn't blink right. By autumn, the Winthrop family portrait was painted, Jonathan at the center, 3 daughters behind him, and 3 infants resting on their laps. The artist never signed his name. That same winter, the cradle in the river vanished. Some said the current took it. Others swore they saw it moving upstream, against the flow, as if something was trying to come back home. By the winter of 1853, the Winthrop plantation had become a place of whispers and avoidance. Workers who once filled the fields with the noise of harvest now moved in silence, crossing themselves when the wind blew from the direction of the manor. It wasn't just fear, it was a sense of trespassing, as though the house itself had become a chapel to something that listened. Jonathan Winthrop began writing what he called The Doctrine of Blood, a thick leather journal bound in hide that he never allowed anyone to touch. He spent long nights under the flicker of whale oil lamps, copying verses from the Bible and replacing divine names with the names of rivers, stones, and ancient tribes no one recognized. He preached not of sin but of cycles, of how a man could cleanse his lineage by returning his blood to the soil it once betrayed. His 3 daughters were no longer seen in town. When a seamstress was summoned to the manor to fit them for mourning dresses, she returned pale and trembling. She said the girls moved strangely, their voices overlapping when they spoke, as though one thought passed through 3 bodies. Their eyes followed her in perfect unison. Elias, the slave chosen for the ritual breeding, was kept separate from the others. He was seen only at dawn, shirtless and fevered, his back marked with symbols drawn not by whip but by hand, circles intersected by nails of ash. He muttered words that weren't his own, words no one could translate. That spring a new sound haunted the fields, children's laughter, echoing from the empty barn at night. The overseer who went to investigate never returned. His boots were found at the threshold, filled with salt water, though the nearest sea lay 200 miles away. Jonathan wrote his final sermon that month. The truest altar is made of family. Then he closed the church for good and boarded the windows of the manor. From that moment, the Winthrop estate began to sink, not into ruin, but into history. By the harvest of 1854, the Winthrop infants had begun to walk. Too soon, the midwife said, too steady for their age. Their hair grew silver blonde, though neither parent carried such color, and their eyes, clouded at birth, had darkened to the hue of riverstone. The daughters, Lydia, Miriam, and Ruth, kept the children hidden from visitors, raising them together as if they shared one mother's mind. When they sang lullabies, the notes tangled in eerie harmony, forming tones no instrument could mimic. Neighbors who passed the manor claimed they saw figures through the upper windows, children pacing in circles, their shadows moving opposite their bodies. One peddler, stopping for water, swore he heard them chanting under their breath, repeating the same 2 words, "We remember." Elias no longer worked the fields. He lived in the smokehouse, silent, his body wasting but his eyes blazing with unending fever. When a fellow slave brought him water, Elias gripped his wrist and whispered, "They ain't mine no more. They belong to the ground." The man fled that night and was never found. Jonathan, meanwhile, grew gaunt, almost transparent beneath the lantern glow. He wrote obsessively in the doctrine of blood, his script evolving into frantic scratches that spiraled across the margins. He began to speak of roots beneath the house, claiming the soil had veins that pulsed when he prayed. One evening, the townsfolk saw all three daughters walking hand in hand toward the chapel, the children following behind like a procession. The doors closed, and for hours light spilled from the cracks in the wood, red and rhythmic like a heart beating. When morning came, the chapel was empty. Only the pews remained, soaked in something darker than candle wax. Days later, a strange vine began to grow from the chapel's floorboards, pale, coiling, and warm to the touch. It smelled faintly of milk and iron. Spring came without birdsong. The Winthrop fields, once ripe with cotton and corn, grew only thistle and vine, choking the earth in white coils. The house itself seemed to hum, an unbroken low vibration that traveled through the floorboards and up the bones of anyone who entered. Jonathan stopped answering the door altogether. He sat in his study, pale as bone, writing names on the walls in red chalk, whispering each one like a prayer he was afraid to finish. The townspeople sent a minister from Savannah to intervene. Reverend Hiram Stowe arrived with 2 deacons and a Bible so worn its spine had split. When he stepped inside the manor, his breath turned to mist despite the heat. He found Jonathan hunched over his desk, muttering that he'd been erased. The Reverend demanded to know what he meant. Jonathan turned to him slowly, and for a moment, Stowe saw that the man's pupils were ringed not by white, but by a crawling gray. Like something alive beneath the eye, he said, "I wrote his name too many times. Now it's writing me." Stowe tried to cleanse the home. He poured salt at every doorway, burned sage, read scripture until his voice cracked. But when he reached the line, "I am that I am," the walls answered back, in a perfect mimic of his voice. The sound came from upstairs, from the nursery. When they opened the door, the children were there, sitting in a perfect circle, their palms pressed to the floorboards. Between them lay Jonathan's journal, open to a page no one had seen before. It showed his own name, written backward, then crossed out by something that had burned through the paper. Jonathan collapsed that night, clutching his chest, calling out for a God he no longer believed in. His last words, according to Stowe, were, "It took my name. Don't let it take theirs." The Reverend fled Georgia 2 days later. The 2 deacons never made it home. By summer's height, the Winthrop Manor was nearly silent. The once grand corridors reeked of copper and damp earth, paint blistered on the walls like old skin, and every mirror had been covered with black cloth. The 3 daughters seldom spoke, and when they did, it was in murmurs, sentences cut short, as though they feared being overheard by the walls themselves. At night, they heard it again, that soft, pulsing sound beneath the floor. It rose like a heartbeat, slow, rhythmic, impossibly deep. Sometimes they'd place their palms to the wood and feel warmth radiating up from the foundation. Other times, when they pressed their ears to the ground, they could swear they heard whispers, dozens of them, chanting their father's name backwards. Ruth, the youngest, was the first to dig. She pried up the planks in the parlor with a kitchen knife, revealing soil as black as pitch. When her sisters found her, she was kneeling in it, her fingers slick with something that wasn't mud. The next morning, her hands were covered in small raised welts shaped like veins. Miriam began to dream of rivers flowing under the house, wide, dark currents carrying faces she recognized but couldn't name. Lydia wrote them down each morning, sketches of heads with closed eyes, mouths stitched shut. One drawing showed her own reflection, mouth sewn but smiling. Then came the odor. Not death, but wet metal, fresh, sharp, and constant. The slaves refused to enter the house. Even the dogs howled and clawed at their chains until Jonathan's eldest daughter released them into the woods. None returned. When a thunderstorm split the sky in late July, lightning struck the chapel. The ground trembled and a fissure opened in the cellar, wide enough to see through. Inside something moved, slowly, rhythmically, like breath beneath the soil. The sisters sealed it with bricks the next morning, but the pulsing did not stop. It grew louder. It followed them, and sometimes late at night they could feel it beating, not under the house but inside. In October of 1854, a letter reached the county registrar from an old midwife named Eliza Crow. She had once delivered babies for every family along the river, but after her visit to the Winthrop estate, she swore never to deliver another child again. The letter was unsigned and unsent, found years later sealed inside her Bible, words smudged by tears or rain. Eliza wrote that she'd been summoned to the manor under cover of night. 3 girls expecting all at once, the servant had whispered, though none in town had seen the Winthrop daughters in nearly a year. When she arrived, the halls were candlelit and crawling with vines that slithered through cracks like vein-seeking air. The air stank of burnt sugar and something metallic, sharp enough to sting the eyes. Upstairs, in the chamber where she was led, she saw them, Lydia, Miriam, and Ruth, each lying upon the floorboards, their gowns soaked through, their bellies swelling and contracting in perfect rhythm. Eliza wrote that they did not scream. They hummed. The sound vibrated through the walls. The humming became words she could not understand, syllables that twisted like serpents in her ears. When the first child came forth, she nearly dropped it. Its skin was luminous in the candlelight, almost translucent. She could see veins pulsing beneath, but the color of the blood was wrong. Not red, not blue, something darker. Something that shifted when she looked too long. The other 2 births followed within minutes. Each infant drew its first breath not with a cry but with a sigh, like an echo, as if air passed through them rather than into them. Eliza fled that night. She left her tools, her satchel, her Bible, all of it. The next morning, the Winthrop servant who had fetched her was found wandering the road barefoot, babbling that the babies had opened their eyes before they were cleaned, and all 3 eyes had moved in unison. The letter ended with one line: "They are not born of flesh, but of the house itself." By the winter of 1855, the Winthrop estate had become an organism, alive, expanding, devouring. Its structure groaned with every sunrise as though adjusting to its own growth. The walls wept moisture even on clear days, and the air carried a warmth that did not belong to the season. Travelers passing the property reported that the windows seemed to breathe, fogging, clearing, then fogging again in slow, steady rhythm. Inside, the daughters rarely spoke. They moved like ghosts through dim halls, leaving food untouched and candles burning at odd hours. The children, 3 of them now almost 2 years old, never left the nursery. They could be heard running across the floorboards, their footsteps perfectly synchronized, their giggles hollow as if echoing through water. When a carpenter from Macon came to repair a collapsed beam, he was found a week later in the nearby swamp, face down, his body pale and bloated. Beneath his fingernails were splinters coated with dried blood and something else, thin fibers resembling root tissue. The coroner said it was impossible for plant matter to grow that deep in human flesh. The house had begun to feed. At night, the sisters said they could hear voices whispering through the pipes, though there was no plumbing. Lydia claimed the voice sounded like their father's, quoting scripture backwards. Miriam disagreed, it was deeper, older. Ruth never spoke at all after that night. She simply began carving symbols into the window frames, the same looping circles that once marked Elias's back. Every object in the house seemed to pulse faintly when touched. Wood felt warm, metal sweated. Even the air trembled when one prayed, and on nights when the moon was new, the ground behind the chapel would bulge upward, as if something below it was trying to breathe. One morning the sisters found the nursery door open, The children were gone. In their place were 3 small depressions in the wood, perfectly round, still damp, and faintly warm, like the house had finally taken back what it had created. When the children vanished, the plantation hands fled. The cabins were left smoldering, food rotting on the tables, doors swinging open to the wind. Only one man returned, Elias. No one knew where he had gone, but by the time he came back, he was not the same. It was late autumn when Lydia saw him walking up the dirt road, barefoot, his clothes in tatters, his skin a pale, blistered gray as if he had been walking through fire and never stopped. He carried nothing but a length of rope and the Winthrop family Bible, soaked through and half-burned. His eyes were clouded and his lips moved constantly in soundless prayer. The sisters brought him inside, though they could not explain why. Elias did not look at them. He went straight to the cellar and knelt on the cold stone, pressing his hands to the floor. The ground pulsed beneath his palms, slow and steady. "It's awake," he rasped. "It's hungry again." That night, Lydia dreamed of her father's voice calling her from beneath the floorboards. "Feed it, my child. Keep it living, and it will keep you whole." She woke to find Elias standing over her bed, his eyes weeping blood. He whispered, "He told me the same thing." The next morning, Miriam found the chapel door open. Elias was inside, kneeling before the pulpit, his back covered in fresh carvings, the same looping sigils that once branded him. He had done them himself, using the rope's frayed ends to draw blood. When he turned, his mouth stretched into a wide, trembling smile. "I saw them," he said. "Your children. They ain't gone. They're under us. They're learning to breathe the way he did." That night thunder shook the house, and the ground beneath the chapel rippled as though stirred by unseen hands. The sisters barred the doors, but the whispering came anyway. 3 voices, soft and familiar, calling each of their names from beneath the floor. Elias sat in the dark, rocking and humming. "He ain't done with us yet," he said. "He's still building his kingdom." By the spring of 1856, the Oconee River changed its course. It began slowly, eddies turning the wrong way, the current sluggish as if resisting something beneath it. Fishermen along the banks said the water grew warm at night, steaming under the moon, and that catfish surfaced belly up with no wounds, just eyes clouded black. The Winthrop estate sat at the river's bend, and those who dared to travel past it swore they saw the water climbing the banks reaching toward the chapel ruins. When it receded, it left behind something strange, a slick, dark residue that shimmered in the sunlight like oil but smelled faintly of blood. Lydia took this as a sign. She told her sisters the river was their father's doing, that he had fed the land so completely it now thirsted for nothing else. Miriam disagreed. She believed it was the children calling back to them, pulling the current home. Ruth said nothing at all, only traced her finger along the glass whenever it rained, following the paths of the droplets until they met at the sill. Then, one morning, the pulsing beneath the house stopped. The silence was heavy, suffocating. For the first time in years, the air was still. The sisters dared to walk outside. The ground under their feet felt hollow, as though a vast cavern lay just beneath the surface. At the edge of the field, Elias knelt before the river, murmuring prayers in a tongue none recognized. The water around him moved against the wind, curling toward his hands. When Lydia tried to pull him away, the current lashed out, splattering her dress with that same slick residue. It burned through the fabric, through her skin down to the bone. Elias only smiled. "It knows you now," he said softly. "You're marked." That night the river rose without rain. It climbed the hill toward the manor inch by inch, soundless except for a faint rhythmic whisper beneath its surface, like hundreds of children laughing under water. When morning came, half the fields were gone. The river had taken them. But the water flowed the wrong way, upstream back toward the house that had birthed it. When the river reversed, the Winthrop house began to bleed. Dark fluid seeped through the walls, thick and slow, carrying the scent of iron and milk. The daughters tried to scrub it away, but the more they cleaned, the more it came, trickling from the seams of the wood like sweat from a fevered body. It wasn't water. It was warm. Miriam swore she heard a pulse behind it. She pressed her ear to the wall and wept. "It's them," she whispered. "They're trying to come through." That night, Lydia gathered what remained of their father's notes, the doctrine of blood, the journal, the Bible Elias had carried back, and spread them across the dining table. Together, the three sisters tried to make sense of what had begun. The writing spoke of a circle made whole through joining, and of the flesh that remembers its origin. They realized, too late, that their father's sermons were not madness but instructions. At midnight, the floor beneath them shuddered. The house groaned like a living thing, and the smell of iron filled the air. From the cracks between the planks, a faint light glowed, red, pulsing as though something enormous and alive moved below. Elias emerged from the shadows, his skin pale as ash, his body trembling. "It's time," he said. "It wants the rest of you." The sisters tried to flee, but the doors were sealed with flesh, pulsing, veined, breathing. The walls rippled. Wood turned soft beneath their hands, becoming warm and pliant, alive. When they screamed, the echoes didn't return. Miriam fell first. The floor split beneath her feet, and something slick and red wrapped around her ankles, pulling her down. Lydia grabbed her hand, but her sister's skin came away in long ribbons. Ruth tried to run, but the walls closed in, pressing her against the pulsing timber until her bones cracked in rhythm with the heartbeat beneath the floor. Elias knelt in the center of the room, smiling through tears. "Communion," he whispered. "He's taking back his flesh." And then the house fell silent again, content as though fed. By dawn, the Winthrop Manor stood still as stone. The air outside was heavy, unmoving. The vines that once wrapped its porch now hung limp, dripping a thin, amber fluid that smelled faintly of sap and blood. For the first time in years, no one heard the house breathe. But silence on that land was never mercy. It was digestion. Elias was the only one left alive. He sat in the parlor, surrounded by the remnants of what the house hadn't taken. Fragments of lace, hairpins, pages of scripture curled and blackened by damp heat. He could still feel them, the sisters moving somewhere beneath him, their heartbeats faint but rhythmic, echoing through the floor like distant drums. That night, the voices came. At first they whispered from the walls, calling his name like children. Then slowly they multiplied. The whispers became a chorus, hundreds of overlapping tones, some high, some impossibly deep. They filled the air until the sound became physical, vibrating through his ribs. Elias clutched his head and screamed, but the noise only swelled, a sea of hollow voices speaking one name, Winthrop. The portrait above the hearth trembled. Jonathan's painted eyes blinked, and the oil began to run like wet ink. His mouth shifted into a grin too wide, too sharp. "You brought it back," the voice said, not from the painting, but from everywhere at once. Elias fell to his knees. "I didn't mean to," he gasped. The house answered with laughter, a deep, wet sound like air bubbling through thick mud. The floorboards bulged, breathing again. The walls flexed and faces began to form within the plaster, human, half-formed, whispering through lips of dust. They mouthed fragments of prayer, but every word came out backward. In desperation, Elias dragged himself to the chapel. The altar was gone, replaced by a gaping fissure lined with pulsing red roots. He leaned over it and saw light flickering far below like stars drowning in blood. Then came the smallest voice, soft and close, from inside the pit. "Father." Elias wept. He whispered, "My children." The voice replied, "We are what he made us." Then the light rose. By the time the townspeople noticed the smell, the Winthrop estate had already begun to transform. The air around the property was thick and sweet, clinging to the throat like spoiled honey. Where the cotton once grew, new plants had sprouted overnight, tall, fibrous stalks with blossoms the color of raw meat. The locals called it the Red Orchard, though no one claimed to have planted it. Each flower pulsed faintly in the sun, closing and opening as though breathing. When a traveler brushed one of the petals, it bled. The sheriff ordered the land burned, but when his men tried to set fire to the field, the flames refused to take. The air was too damp. The soil hissed beneath the torch as though rejecting the heat. Inside the manor, Elias hadn't slept for days. The laughter of the voices had changed. It now carried melody, the same lullaby the sisters once sang to their children. He walked through the house following the sound until it led him to the back door, where the vines had split open the frame. Beyond the porch, the orchard stretched endlessly, red flowers swaying without wind. At the center of the field stood the three sisters, or what remained of them. Their bodies were wrapped in tendrils that sprouted from the soil, their eyes wide and white. They did not move, but the vines pulsed where they entered the earth, pumping a dark fluid back and forth like a living artery. Elias stumbled forward, weeping. "Please," he begged, "let them rest." The sisters smiled in unison. Their mouths opened, and a thick red mist poured out, swirling upward. The sound that followed was not human. It was a chorus of infants crying beneath the earth. The sky above the orchard turned the color of rust. The birds fell from it dead before they hit the ground, and from the manor the heartbeat returned, slow, steady, and louder than ever. The house, the field, the sisters, and the soil had become one body, breathing, feeding, remembering. That night the river rose again. This time it flowed red. When the sheriff finally rode out to the Winthrop estate, he brought 6 men with him, 3 armed deputies, 2 laborers, and a preacher from the neighboring parish. They went not as lawmen but as witnesses. The entire county had begun to talk of the red blossoms that bled when touched, of the cries that echoed at night from the river bend. No one believed it fully, but no one dared go alone. By noon they reached the edge of the property. The air grew colder. The sky, clear when they left town, dimmed as if a storm were hiding directly above the house. The preacher muttered that the air felt wet with something unholy. One of the deputies coughed and spat black phlegm. Another swore he heard children laughing in the distance, though the fields were empty. The moment they stepped into the orchard, the earth gave a low groan. The stalks swayed around them without wind. A copper scent hung heavy. The sheriff ordered his men to stay close. Each step made the soil twitch underfoot, soft, warm, faintly pulsing. When they reached the manor, they found the door open. Elias stood in the doorway, barefoot, his clothes soaked and clinging. He didn't speak at first. He only stared past them into the trees, his eyes glazed as if fixed on something invisible. "We came to help," the preacher said, lifting his Bible. Elias smiled faintly. "Help who?" he whispered. "There's no one left to help." The sheriff stepped forward and saw his reflection in Elias's pupils. Not a face, but a shifting mass of veins and roots. He drew his gun. The floor beneath him rippled, and his boots sank half an inch into living earth. The preacher began to pray, but his voice faltered. The house trembled in answer. From inside came the sound of footsteps, tiny, countless, pattering across the ceiling like rain. Then a voice spoke from everywhere at once, soft, childish, and wrong. "Father's law," it said, "is still in the soil." The sheriff fired once. The echo never came back. Outside, the red orchard began to move. The sheriff's men never returned to town. For 3 days, the people of Clark County heard nothing but the wind carrying faint echoes from the direction of the Winthrop estate. Soft, wet sounds, like something digging. On the 4th night, the preacher's horse staggered back into town without a rider, its flanks slashed open, eyes white with terror. The saddle was slick with red clay that pulsed faintly before drying to dust. By the time another search party was proposed, no one volunteered. The town doctor, a pragmatic man, declared the land cursed and sealed off the road with iron gates. Yet still, people whispered of music carried on the night air, music made of laughter, humming and the distant rhythm of shovels scraping soil. Weeks later, 2 boys hunting raccoons near the river vanished. When a group of farmers went searching, they found the earth along the riverbank freshly turned. Beneath a thin layer of red soil they uncovered bones, small, delicate, arranged in spirals. In the center of each spiral lay a wooden toy, carved crudely but polished smooth by many hands. The doctor who examined them swore the bones weren't human. Too soft, he said. Too new. Yet the toys, small dolls with stitched eyes, were clearly carved in the likeness of children. One farmer, a veteran of the war in Mexico, refused to stay quiet. He claimed he'd seen movement under the ground, like fish swimming in mud. When he tried to show the others, the soil beneath his feet gave way, swallowing him to the waist. Something cold brushed his leg. He screamed until they dragged him out, bleeding from dozens of small circular marks like the bites of infants' gums. That night, the town sealed their windows. The river began to whisper again, the sound rolling through the valley like lullabies sung from beneath the ground. Those who listened long enough could make out words. The same phrase repeated in small childish voices. The family grows. And just before dawn, the ground at the Winthrop estate rose and fell, slow, gentle, rhythmic like a great lung breathing beneath the soil. He came back at sunset, stumbling out of the red orchard barefoot and half-naked, his skin streaked with mud that shimmered like blood in the dying light. The preacher, Reverend Stowe, the same man who had fled years ago after Jonathan Winthrop's death, was alive. Or something close to it. His eyes were milk white, his hair fallen out in patches, and his lips moved without sound, as if he were still preaching to a congregation no one else could see. The first to find him was a washerwoman drawing water from the well behind her cabin. She said he looked at her, smiled faintly, and whispered, "The sermon's begun again." Then he collapsed. When the doctor examined him, he found the preacher's pulse slow but steady. The man's veins, however, ran dark beneath his skin like thin, moving worms. That night, Stowe awoke screaming. His voice wasn't his own. It was deeper, layered, as though 3 people were speaking through him at once. The townsfolk rushed to his bedside and found him sitting upright, hands gripping the sheet so tightly his nails split. His eyes rolled back, and through cracked lips he recited passages from the book of Genesis. Then he began naming them. Jonathan, Lydia, Miriam, Ruth, Elias. His head turned sharply toward the window that faced the Winthrop property. "And now the children," he said, smiling through bloodied teeth. "They've learned to speak." The doctor tried to restrain him, but Stowe's body convulsed violently, rising from the bed with a sound like splitting wood. His ribs began to move, flexing outward as if breathing on their own. Beneath his skin, something pressed outward, shapes small and shifting like hands searching for light. When it ended, Stowe collapsed, his chest still. But his mouth continued to move, whispering words no one could decipher. The doctor leaned close and froze. The sound wasn't coming from the preacher, it was coming from inside him. The whisper said, "The roots have reached the church." And far away, on the hill where the Winthrop Chapel once stood, the ground began to crack open. By the following morning, every window in Clark County glowed faintly red. It wasn't sunlight, it was something thicker, duller, almost alive. When the townsfolk stepped outside, they found the air heavy with a scent like crushed roses and meat left to spoil in the heat. The trees along the river were no longer green. Their branches had bloomed overnight with flowers so red they seemed to drink the light from the air. Children ran to gather the petals, laughing, until they touched them. The laughter stopped. Their fingers blistered where the blossoms had rested. The petals stuck to their skin, refusing to fall away, and when the mothers tried to pull them off, they tore like flesh. The doctor went to the orchard first, though his hands trembled the whole way. The red soil was moving again, slowly breathing. He noticed small buds breaking through the surface like seedlings. But these weren't plants. Each bud pulsed, and as he leaned closer, he saw faces beneath the film. Tiny, shifting faces, half-formed, opening their mouths as though trying to cry. Then came the sound. A deep hum rolled across the valley, low and steady, as if the earth itself were chanting. It came from the direction of the Winthrop Chapel, what was left of it. The roof had collapsed, and from the broken foundation rose vines of human hair, tangled with bones and cloth. The altar had split open, and from within bloomed a massive flower, slick and glistening, its petals made of pale skin. In its center hung the bodies of the sheriff's men, their faces serene, eyes open as though in worship. Their mouths moved together, mouthing the same words, "The family endures." By dusk, the red bloom had spread across the river. The air shimmered. Birds fell from the sky, their feathers dissolving midair. Livestock refused to move. And beneath the soil, something vast and wet began to stir, a pulse that matched the beating of every heart in town. That night, no one slept. The sky bled softly, and from the Winthrop fields came the sound of lullabies, sung not by mothers but by the earth itself. At midnight, the bells of the abandoned Winthrop Chapel began to ring on their own. Each toll rolled through the valley like thunder underwater, slow, wet, and resonant. The town gathered at their windows, staring toward the dark outline of the plantation on the hill. There was no fire, no torchlight, yet the house glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the bells, as though breathing. And then, through the mist, they began to appear. 3 figures walked the long road down from the estate, women or something like them. Their dresses were tattered and slick, the fabric clinging to their skin like damp roots. Their faces looked familiar to the older townsfolk, the Winthrop daughters thought long dead. But their eyes were hollowed, filled not with white or iris, but an undulating red shimmer, like light passing through blood. Behind them came Elias. He walked as though half drowned, his movements sluggish, his hands dragging something along the ground, a length of vine made from braided flesh. In his other hand he carried a child, or what appeared to be one. It was quiet, limp, yet breathing in shallow, watery gasps. When they reached the gates of town, the air thickened. The preacher's body, still lying cold in the doctor's parlor, began to murmur again, lips twitching to form words. "They've remembered," it said. "They've come for the ones who forgot." The first townsman to step forward was the mayor. He shouted for them to turn back, that this land was no longer theirs. The eldest daughter raised her head. Her smile was small, kind, almost human. "We never left," she said softly. "We've been under your feet the whole time." The vines followed her words. They crept along the ground, slow at first, then faster, wrapping around fence posts, crawling up the houses, splitting the earth like fragile glass. From every crack, a red light poured outward, pulsing like veins beneath skin. And as the people fled, the child in Elias's arms opened its eyes. There were too many of them, small, wet, blinking eyes spreading across its face. It began to cry. The sound wasn't a child's cry. It was the sound of the ground itself opening wide to feed. By dawn, Clark County was no longer a town. It was a wound. The roads had turned to mud so red it reflected the sky like a mirror of flesh. Houses leaned inward as though pulled by invisible roots. The air buzzed, not with flies but with whispers. Some swore they could still hear the church choir singing, but the melody twisted, bending into sobs. The first to die were those who ran for the river. They thought the water would carry them away, wash off whatever curse the Winthrops had awakened. But when they reached the banks, the river was already rising, not with water but with a slow tide of viscous red liquid, thick and breathing. One man said it looked like blood. Another said it smelled like it too. The third didn't have time to speak before something pulled him under. From the fields the flowers bloomed fully. They weren't blossoms anymore, but mouths, wide, wet, whispering the names of the dead. Each petal was a face, eyes open, teeth forming the same word again and again. Father. Elias stood at the center of the old plantation grounds, the vine still wrapped around his arm. The child clutched to his chest. The daughters stood around him, forming a circle, their hair hanging in thick ropes. The eldest looked toward the town and said almost gently, "He built us to endure." Then the ground erupted. Roots tore through the soil, splitting houses, dragging horses into the earth. People screamed as the streets opened beneath them, but the sound barely carried, drowned out by the hum rising from the chapel ruins. The preacher's voice joined it, though he had no body left to speak with. His words rolled through the red mist. The seed has taken root. By evening, the Winthrop estate had vanished entirely, swallowed into a perfect, pulsating mound. Only the chapel's bell tower remained, half buried and trembling. From within its broken walls, faint light pulsed, steady like a heartbeat. And when the wind shifted, the sound of crying came again. Not from above, from beneath. Thousands of small voices layered into one. The family grows. Decades passed before anyone spoke the Winthrop name aloud again. Clark County was erased from every map by 1902. Its land sold, renamed, and later abandoned entirely after miners reported the ground breathing beneath their boots. Nothing grew there. Nothing died either. The soil stayed red as if forever wet. Then, in 1928, a historian from Atlanta, Dr. Miriam Vale, came across an unmarked chest in the cellar of an old courthouse. Inside were waterlogged ledgers, fragments of letters, and a small, rusted key wrapped in linen. The papers bore the seal of the Winthrop family. Most were unreadable, the ink melted into a reddish blur. But one document, dated June 11, 1852, remained clear. It was a sermon. The handwriting was elegant, steady, unmistakably that of Reverend Stowe. The title read, "The Binding of Blood and Soil." What followed was not scripture, but instruction. Pages describing rituals of conception, lineage, and the preservation of divine inheritance through the flesh of the chosen. It spoke of blood planted, not spilled, of children sown in earth until the soil remembers its maker. Vale brought her discovery to the university archives. The archivist refused to handle the papers, claiming the ink left stains that wouldn't wash away. But Vale persisted, translating each fragment, reconstructing a genealogy that stretched from Jonathan Winthrop back to a 17th-century preacher accused of necromancy in Salem. Her final note was brief. The Winthrops believed they could grow souls. They succeeded. 2 weeks later, the lights in the archive burned red and would not extinguish. The janitor found Dr. Vale's body at her desk, her mouth filled with dirt, her eyes wide open. The papers were gone. Only the linen remained, soaked through with a dark fluid that smelled faintly of iron and roses. When police emptied the waste bin, they found a scrap of parchment pressed flat and wet, as if newly written. On it were 3 words written in a hand not human: "The family waits," and in the distance, near the forgotten stretch of land once called Clark County, faint red light flickered beneath the soil. Even now, if you travel far enough along the forgotten back roads of rural Georgia, past the rusted mile markers and the fields gone to ruin, you can find what remains of Clark County. There are no homes, no records, no markers, only a stretch of earth that hums faintly when the wind dies. Locals say the sound isn't the wind at all. They say it's breathing. The land there refuses to die. Crops planted in it bloom overnight, but their roots twist in impossible patterns. Animals born nearby are malformed, some with too many limbs, some with none. And every so often, when it rains, the red soil rises to the surface, slick and warm, pulsing like the slow beat of a buried heart. Government surveyors came once, in 1951. They left within a day, sealing their findings under geological anomaly. One of them, before he vanished, sent a letter to his wife. "There's something alive under the earth. It listens when you speak. People who camp near the site say they hear children singing in the dark a lullaby with no known tune. Others claim to see faint lights flickering beneath the dirt, like lanterns or eyes. The ground shifts underfoot, soft and restless, as though thousands of small hands are pressing upward from below. At the center of the field, the soil forms a mound that swells and contracts with the seasons. Scientists call it thermal expansion. Locals call it the breath. Every decade someone disappears. Hikers, drifters, surveyors, anyone foolish enough to dig too deep. The sheriff's office lists them as missing, but the people who live nearby know better. Sometimes after a heavy storm, small things wash up along the edges of the dirt. Toys carved from wood, locks of braided hair, or bones too small to belong to animals. Each item smells faintly of roses and iron. And if you kneel beside that mound at night, when the world is still and the stars burn low, you can hear it whisper from beneath your feet, soft, rhythmic, familiar. The family grows. Then the soil moves again, slow, patient,